the vast majority of people have never heard of the Democracy Shield, and the vast majority of people are not really interested in the ins and the outs of the propaganda campaign. But the point is that the emphasis is very much on foreign interference, and foreign interference has now become this all-encompassing phenomenon.
I think you have seen how powerful drones are also as a tool of propaganda. The pictures and the videos could be seen everywhere, and it was a huge propaganda blow to the Russians. And now a lot of actors have obviously discovered that you can replicate this. You can disturb European Council meeting in Denmark. Why does the EU need to regulate family law, marriage law, who is a man, who is a woman? There are vastly different opinions across the member states on this, vastly different cultures. Why do we need to have the same laws on gender in Slovakia than in the Netherlands? Two different societies.
So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. As ever, I'm Jacob Reynolds, Head of Policy at MCC Brussels. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look at elections in Moldova. We're going to look at Europe's drone problem, and we're going to take a look at a constitutional change in Slovakia. This week, to dig into the topics, delighted to welcome back our Executive Director, Furedi. Welcome back.
Pleasure.
And also welcome back to our colleague, Richard Schenk.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, kicking off this week with the elections in Moldova, was the topic that really occupied the Brussels bubble this week, because they saw it very much as a victory. It was the pro-EU side that kind of cleaned up in the elections. But the darker story that wasn't necessarily reported on as much is the enormous amount of interference by the EU in these elections, and also the fact that it took the banning of two parties on the eve of the election to get the election over the line for the pro-EU side. So fitting into a bit of a pattern of elections that we've discussed on the podcast in terms of both the role of censorship, social media, and also outright banning and overturning of elections and things like this. But Richard, you followed this election in a little bit of detail. What was the kind of story of the election?
Well, we need to go step back a bit, because I think most people are not into election dynamics in Moldova. So it's a very tiny country, 3 million people, and we have a huge section of the electorate abroad, because many Moldovans emigrated from poverty to Western Europe, but also to Russia. So about 1.5 million Moldovans were voting abroad. So it's a huge proportion compared to the overall countryside. And also, it's a very poor country. It's a country with a very bad track record regarding corruption, democracy, and so on. So it was it was not among the best circumstances that all these allegations of foreign interference began to emerge. And to be honest, it was because of the geostrategical situation in Ukraine, with the Ukraine war. You have had a very tense atmosphere, and the EU was openly wanted to have a certain result in Moldova. They have pressured digital platforms to ban false informations, as they say usually. And also, there were huge efforts within the EU to mobilize the huge Moldovan expert community to vote in favor of the pro-EU parties. Obviously, the claim was that there was also interference from Russia, but the exact amount of foreign interference, because there was so much of it, is very hard to quantify. Obviously, this will be a dispute. And very interestingly, because Moldova doesn't have a very stable party system, to put it mildly, two opposition parties were banned just days before the election. Most likely they wouldn't have won the elections, but nevertheless they could have cost the majority for the ruling pro-EU party. So this was kind of like desperate measure to tip the favors in the balance in their favor. And a huge mess. But to be honest, it didn't really matter that much, because Moldova is a semi-presidential system. The president is already in favor of EU integration, and also last year they have enshrined into the constitution at the same time as they elected the president that they want to access the EU. So it wasn't already just basically the last piece that the EU needed to fast-track Moldova into the EU. But I think we are going to speak about fast-tracking countries into the EU, about this topic soon as well.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, this was one of these cases where I think few people who understand Moldovan politics would deny that there's Russian interference in the elections, or at least the Russians trying to interfere in the elections. But this whole narrative of Russian interference seemed to paper over the fact that there was enormous interference by the EU in the election as well.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because Moldova is a very good example of 19th century democratic manipulation politics merging with high-tech concerns about false information in the 21st century. Because in many ways, what you have in Moldova is a system that's formally democratic, where the parties kind of come and go, and where there is a lot of foreign interference by all sides. That's in the nature of things. It's only in the more recent time that we have this idea that on the one side there are angels who have integrity and respect the voice of the people. On the other side, you have the devil, in this case Russia, who just completely manipulates things overall. But for me, the really interesting thing about the election is not really about Moldova, but about the nature of the EU's propaganda war, the way that it kind of targets particular electorates and tries to use the fact that there's an information war coming from the other side as a way of delegitimating certain political actors and parties. And this process was tested, and quite effectively tested, and in the case of Romania, where similar arguments were used to delegitimate the results of an election, and is now being exported to other parts of Europe. So what we're seeing now is a fairly constant attempt by the European Union to compensate for its lack of legitimacy by using propaganda warfare and using the kind of the coercive elements of that as a way of trying to stabilize the situation. And Moldova, I think, really fits into that. And because, as Richard was saying, the election and its as an election wasn't that important. Right? We more or less knew what would happen when we were there. What was important was the hysteria that the Brussels stirred around it as a way of kind of creating a story, a narrative that they could export elsewhere later on.
Yeah, I'm interested to dig into this, Richard, because part of this is actually being formalized at the moment by the European Commission and the proposals for the Democracy Shield, for example, where they're going to bring together a whole range of very similar activities, working on crackdown on social media, looking at ways to so-called fortify elections and throwing lots of money at NGOs and the rest of it. So this is, as Frank says, is something that they're trying out, but it's also about to become a very formal part of the way the EU operates.
Yes, indeed. I mean, already there are a lot of communications or non-binding resolutions by institutions that are basically speaking about this. It was also, if you look into the official Commission statements and Council conclusions, you can see a lot of efforts to, as they say, as to act against democratic backsliding. And they want to target elections, media, the judicial system. Everything should be streamlined in a fashion that, as they say, democratic elections should be shielded from foreign interference. But currently, to be honest, I see that in countries that are more vulnerable, like Moldova or Romania, this kind of works. But in bigger countries that are more to the EU's center, and I mean like center of publicity, where there's a much more vivid democratic culture and public scrutiny of these measures, this doesn't seem to matter that much. So we have just this weekend we will have elections in Czechia, and even though the same arguments have been raised again, because the Czech state and the Czech democracy is in a much better shape than Moldova is, it doesn't seem to matter that much for the outcome of this election so far.
Yeah, and it's important to note as well, Frank, that the focus is very much on the so-called foreign interference as like a key underpinning of this kind of narrative.
It is the foreign interference, and in a sense, it doesn't have to work in a way that people domestically internalize the EU narrative. Because I think the vast majority of people have never heard of the Democracy Shield, and the vast majority of people are not really interested in the ins and the outs of the propaganda campaign. But the point is that the emphasis is very much on foreign interference, and foreign interference has now become this all-encompassing phenomenon by which you use as a way of interfering, not just rhetorically, not just propagandistically, but actually physically by banning certain candidates, by banning certain kind of political parties. And I see that happening more and more in some countries where you can get away with this. I mean, Czechia is one example where there is a lot of talk about preventing Babiš from getting elected, and maybe the president would veto his accession to power. But I think it's also an important element because it involves establishing alliances and networks, and ultimately it's a kind of neo-colonial strategy of directly interfering within the electoral process in a number of different ways. And I see that as the new wave of federalism. It's a new extension of the politicization of the rule of law, which has been going on for some time. But they're now applying that to the elections much more directly.
Yeah, you could see how the countries on the EU's periphery were affected. This neo-colonial attitude, nobody was a better example for this than Emmanuel Macron and his last year's interference in the Romanian elections. This would be unthinkable that the French president comments on the outcome of a German election in the fashion that he did on the Romanian election. So this is, you see the double standard applied to different kinds of democracies. But also interesting how the democracy shield shifted over time, because first they wanted to, the EU Commission was much more focused on the integrity of elections, and then they came up with a number of proposals, and then they soon discovered that elections, how they are organized and how they work and how they produce seats in a parliament, are working very, very differently across the continent. So they couldn't come up with a common standard for elections because France has, for example, a majoritarian system with a runoff. At the same time, many countries have a proportional system. So they couldn't unify European democracies. They are very different. We have different political cultures, institutions. So instead, they shifted the entire focus towards foreign interference, which gives them a much more broad leeway to interfere with the formulation of public opinion. And then the electoral systems do not matter that much, actually.
Right, so we just talked about the kind of hysteria surrounding Russian interference, and now hysteria gripping Europe over drones, and so drones are being sighted everywhere. They've closed down airport, essentially, in anticipation of big European summit in Denmark. There's allegations flying backwards and forwards between Ukraine and Hungary about who's launching drones at who. We've had incursions, supposedly, of Russian drones into NATO airspace, and everybody talking about how eager they are to shoot them down. Frank, we could talk about exactly all of these different examples, but what's actually driving this kind of new focus or this hysteria about drones, and what does it say about the kind of slightly unstable world that we're in?
Well, I think the premise of all this is that there is an inherent instability in the geopolitical makeup of the European Union and Europe itself, which basically means that in a very fluid situation, the anxieties that are raised can attach themselves to anything. And I think in this case, what has happened is that the various anxieties about tension and conflict have acquired a more palpable form in relation to the drone phenomenon. The problem that I have with discussing this is I honestly do not know who to believe. I mean, it's very difficult to know what is fact and what is fiction in relation to this, because I have not been able to come across any real tangible evidence that I could use to make a very clear political judgment. However, what is very, very clear is that the phenomenon of the drones has been used, as you would expect, quite pragmatically and opportunistically by the different actors, so that Poland can use it to promote its own orientation towards defense. The Scandinavian countries, the Baltic republics, can all use this as a way of making arguments about the need to form new kinds of cooperation, new forms of alliances. And what I really worry about is that it might seem like, sort of fairly innocent at the moment. It's just drones, and nobody has lost their lives. There's no real problem. But given the militarized nature of this discussion, I think it's always possible that somebody would take a step too far and precipitate a cycle of events that could lead to conflict, albeit to begin with in a very confined space, but once conflict becomes imminent within the system, and once you have actual clashes, physical clashes, on the basis of this, then there's a danger that we're well on our way to a war, eventually to a real military conflict. So I think now is the time to try to pull back a little bit and get a much more detached, objective understanding of what is really taking place, rather than to suddenly argue for this massive drone shield that you want to build to protect Europe and Ukraine from presumably Russian drone intervention. I am suspicious of this, and I think that to some extent the hysteria has been used as a way of creating an atmosphere that is disposed towards a greater escalation of military intervention. What I really would like to know is, what is really true and what isn't really true.
Yeah, and Richard, I mean, one of the things about this that's hard to get a grip on is that European countries, European militaries are kind of so far behind when it comes to drones anyway that it's difficult for them to even figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, in Germany, we just like 4 years ago, we had a debate about should drones carry weapons. So and the Bundeswehr had like some small drones and some borrowed for the Israelis, and that was it. And they completely missed the point. I mean, some other armies like the French or the British forces were a bit better equipped, but nevertheless they have completely missed this. That drones have completely changed warfare. They have created basically an open space, battlefield where everything, a transparent battlefield where everything can be monitored. What happens? So and honestly, I think if we now come to the EU's now big military buildup, obviously they're speaking a lot about drones, but I don't know if they really got the or even for a military strategic point, the right emphasis. Because, for example, like tanks, they're still applied on the battlefield in Ukraine, but very differently. But nevertheless, we are just talking about rebuilding our tank forces in Europe. So I don't know how exactly this led to a real development of military capabilities into Europe. But currently, to be honest, it's still something that's not even financed yet to be rolled out on a large scale. Because I think until the EU really reacts and keeps up with this current development, then another one would be already on its way. So I think this central planning of military capabilities is really not flexible enough. Very small forces of Azerbaijan, for example, were able to deploy new drone tactics a year before the Ukraine war began against Armenia. So you need to be much more flexible, much more flexible, and than the EU's large central organized projects are in a modern battlefield.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, kind of historical experience shows the dangers of not really understanding the unfolding of events in a way that is appropriate. So what I really worry about is that what the EU is going to do is to develop its own equivalent Maginot Line, and imagining that by doing that it could become effective. I think there's a danger in the EU, a very real danger in the EU, that they basically are in the business of organizing to fight the war before last.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then you basically end up with a lot of military hardware that is entirely useless. And the point that Richard makes about the importance of context, about the importance of flexible response, about the importance of innovating on the battlefield in relation to your experience is really, really quite important, because at the end of the day, that's how our resources can be used most effectively. And I think in the end, at the end of the day, the most effective defense, in the long run, in the European context, is minimal cooperation, but maximum emphasis on nations developing their own capacities under the command of their own defense forces.
And Richard, do you have any greater insight into actually what's going on with these supposed drone incursions? I mean, like, they feel like they have to shut down, as I say, the entire airport in Denmark and a whole zone in Denmark in order for this conference to take place. So do you understand what's going on?
Well, I think you have seen how powerful drones are also as a tool of propaganda. When the Ukrainians attacked these Russian nuclear bombers across the world, the actual damage they did, as we know now, was not that huge. But the pictures and the videos could be seen everywhere across, and it was a huge propaganda blow to the Russians, and a huge propaganda win for the Ukrainians. And well, you can now. A lot of actors have obviously discovered that you can replicate this. You can disturb European Council meeting in Denmark. You can. There were drone incursions between Hungary and Ukraine. So this stuff is actually very hard to detect who's really behind it, but it creates a lot of press and publicity and stirs up a lot of emotions. So they are more like it's not actually war on the physical battlefield, but much more for the public opinion.
So this is a typical example of the fault of EU risk aversion, where the European Union has learned to avoid risk by being extremely cautious, and best exemplified by the precautionary principle. And basically, because of its hasn't got the appetite for risk, and tends to regard the slightest threat as an existential one rather than as something that you basically have to deal with, instead of regarding some of these drone incursions as a technical problem rather than a military problem, it basically ends up shutting down airports. And we've seen this. All you need, for example, we had this situation in England where all you needed was just a couple of drones hovering over nearby, and Heathrow Airport, gets shut down. One of the biggest airports in the world gets shut down, and it has a huge impact on society. So what we're seeing is that somebody is taking advantage of the EU's risk aversion as a way of making a very important impact on a low-cost basis. It doesn't cost very much to scare the EU at the moment, and that's what people are banking on.
So now coming on to Slovakia, we had quite interesting news from Slovakia, that a major kind of motion that many people didn't think was actually going to get through passed, which meant that would be enshrined in the Slovakian constitution a number of kind of fundamental, what used to be regarded as fundamental common sense ideas, such as that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, but also lots of references to the primacy of Slovakian sovereignty over EU law, references on the Slovakian constitution will regard gender transition in a different way. Whole host of things, which on the one hand represents a big victory for Fico, but on the other hand sets up a collision course with Brussels. Richard, what's going on, and is there a kind of another looming battle between Slovakia and Brussels on the horizon?
Yes, but the battle is actually less legal than about politics and political culture, because Slovakia has not touched upon something technical like competition law or something, but they have touched on they have to question the EU's holy cow, the gender ideology, and they're just rebelling a bit. So already the mere fact that they're rebelling is quite dangerous for Brussels. And but it's actually quite surprising that this motion got passed, because it required a 2/3 majority in the parliament. So there was actually quite a broad consensus among the Slovakian parties on this issue. Not only the governing coalition's parties supported it. And I think there should not be a real conflict on this. Why does the EU need to regulate family law, marriage law, who is a man, who is a woman? There are vastly different opinions across the member states on this, vastly different cultures. Why do we need to have the same laws on gender in Slovakia than in the Netherlands? Two different societies. This is where the EU should just step back a bit and let the member state do their job. But this is not possible, because the EU actually wants to encroach on these areas that are used to be unquestionably national competencies. But because Brussels is so obsessed with this culture war issues, they see them as European values, even though they are not European values, to be honest. This as just thrown into the room without any real societal consensus behind this. If you ask across Europe, man and woman should well, are these the two genders? Then like about 1/3 say no, there should be more genders, but 2/3 of the people usually support this kind of policies. Then you can continue on other culture war issues as well. So why do we need to be as an EU obsessed with this? And this is just explainable through the internal dynamics of the Brussels bubble, because these people here it's majority, and while in the European population it's a minority position, and they see themselves as the guardians of European values. And
so this is a very interesting issue, because on most matters the EU Commission is tone deaf. It basically listens to its own people, but is completely unable to understand the passions that exist within society. And gender is one of those issues that it has embraced wholeheartedly. But paradoxically, gender is one of those issues on which it's extremely vulnerable, because, as Richard was suggesting, the majority of European people still thankfully believe that there are essentially sort of two sexes in this world, man and a woman. That's something that is essential for their day-to-day lives. That's how they live their lives. And I think that what Brussels is slowly realizing, that when it comes to this particular issue, it's in a sense on the back foot. And it seems to me that here we have a very important development occurring, a development that was recognized first in Hungary, which basically told the EU that on gender issues, it's going down a different path. And now other countries are beginning to wake up to this. And what's happening in Slovakia is basically, through the prism of gender, they're asserting their national sovereignty, their claim to have the right to make decisions about their everyday life, and not listen to the song sheet that Brussels puts out for them. So this is a very interesting issue, and I think that the fact that Slovakia has gone ahead and done this is really important, because if they get away with this, then it's only a matter of time before other countries will go down the same path.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why, and just to stay with this, Frank, because that's why they've also brought with it a declaration of Slovakian sovereignty, that Slovakian law on these issues will take primacy over EU law. And whilst that will inevitably or likely get challenged or at least taken up in the EU courts, it's an indicative sweep, as it were, of how lots of countries are finding on issues such as gender or the environment, or notably on migration, that they have forced to take action, and that means asserting the primacy of their own kind of national law over EU law.
It is, and it's much easier for countries to do that on gender, because they will get support. They will be even supported by parties that are much more pro-EU than they are, less committed to national sovereignty. When it comes to gender, they know that unless they're on the right side, they're going to lose electoral support. So this is important for that reason. But I think that the way that Slovakia has challenged the supremacy of EU-created law is really quite important, because in the recent years, the European Union and its lawyers and its prosecutors have time and time again insisted that EU law comes prior. That's the dominant supreme law, and can trump the laws that are made within national parliaments. So it's a very important test case, and it's particularly important for Central and East European societies who are much more concerned about ensuring that their values, which are often antithetical to that of the European Union Commission, are protected and defended.
Yeah, and Richard, I mean, Frank just made reference to the fact that on these gender issues, even pro-EU parties kind of go with them. This was actually quite decisive, as I know you know, in the Slovakian case. Could you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so in Slovakia we have a governing coalition out of 3 parties. So quite a wide mix of different political groups that here came together, but they had a majority of 1 vote, 1 seat in the parliament so far. So far away from the 2/3 majority required to change the constitution. But the opposition consisted of 2 groups, basically. One was the Progressive Liberal Party, but there was also a party of the former Prime Minister, who is now in opposition, but he is actually aligned with the European People's Party. So he's a pro-EU party on paper, but nevertheless he heavily relies on rural electorates and traditional Christian Democrat voters. So he actually supported the proposal, and the government now kind of managed to split the opposition, because the progressive liberals were staunchly against this proposal, while this EPP-attached party was in favor of it. And now you can see that how because many people counted on Fico's fall because he only had such a slim majority, but now that he managed to stabilize his political situation through this issue. And this is also quite an interesting political signal. If you win cultural wars at home, then you are going to win elections, or at least stay in power. That's an important signal to the outside world.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of issues actually coming up that I'm sure we're going to dig into in this podcast about the way in which properly conservative parties are hoping to peel off those EPP-aligned parties, or at least their voters, into a kind of grander coalition. So we'll talk about that some more. But for now, that's it from the podcast. If you enjoyed us on the MCC Brussels podcast, please make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We really appreciate that. We also love hearing your comments, so please keep them coming. But for now, thank you very much to Frank.
Pleasure.
And Richard, thanks for joining us.
Have a nice day.